Hello, everyone. We are going to be getting started here in just a few minutes. We just want to give people a few more minutes to log in to join us. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, IoT Security, Debunking the We Aren't That Connected myth. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Ultimately, we want to hear from you. So in addition to a few audience polls, we encourage you to submit your questions via the Ask Question button throughout the presentation today. Our presenter will answer as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. If you experience any audio issues during the session, please click on the Rate This button on top of your player window and follow the instructions to receive help. And a friendly reminder, this event will be available on demand just a few minutes after the session concludes, and we're also planning on sending a copy of the recording and the slides to everyone in attendance. We'd also like to invite you to follow our channel to view upcoming events and on-demand content after today's session as well. Now let's get started by introducing today's presenter, CEO of Security Innovation, Ed Adams. Ed is a software quality and security expert with over 20 years experience in the field. He began his career as an engineer for the U.S. Army, which is why he still considers himself an engineer at heart. Later, he served as a member of Security Innovation Board of Directors since its inception in 2002 and took over as CEO in 2003. Today, Ed is a research fellow at the Ponemon Institute, serves on the board of several IT security organizations, and was named Privacy by Design Ambassador by the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And with that, Ed, it's off to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone for joining our IoT security webcast. I'll be talking with you for about the next 40 to 45 minutes, and at the end of the presentation, we will leave some time for some live Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to enter them, as Rebecca said, in the questions, with the questions functionality in the BrightTalk platform. So very quickly, for those of you that don't know Security Innovation, this is the obligatory what we do and how we do it slide. And essentially, we at Security Innovation focus on reducing the risk of software wherever it is deployed. And if you're on this webcast because you're interested in IoT, you know that software is basically deployed in pretty much every device that is exchanging some kind of data. And how we do it is through nearly 18 years of expertise, serving as a trusted advisor to some of the most recognizable brands in the world, some of which you can now see on your screen. As I mentioned, with research security vulnerabilities in software for a number of years, over 15 years, we have published 18 separate books and guides during that time, including a number with co-published with Microsoft, and many of our subject matter experts are either MVPs or Hall of Famers for various technology companies as listed. Personally, I spent a lot of time as an engineer in my career, both as a mechanical engineer and a software engineer. And in my younger days, I built non-lethal weapon systems, much like what you see pictured on the screen, for the federal government. And that fast hardening foam retrofitted in a scuba tank was one of the more fun projects that I had the privilege of working on. But just as you can tell from my background, I am an engineer by training and at heart. I tend to think like an engineer, and as a result, part of the presentation that I'm delivering here is geared toward those folks that tend to be in more technical roles to complement that which I normally talk about, which is a lot of the business risk, business continuity, information security, risk management teams, essentially that operate in and around the information security world in large enterprises. Here's what we're going to be talking about today. 4 agenda items, starting off with a little bit of an IoT security landscape and what makes it so different and difficult. We'll then jump into IoT attack surface, managing the liability and risks of IoT, and finally, some very prescriptive tips on auditing IoT development and deployment. So starting with a trip down memory lane to the good old days where devices were just devices. And for those of you that don't recognize some of these devices, the very first one on the bottom left, that's actually an EKG machine that they would hook up, and depending on the modernization of your doctor's office, might still use it. They hook up little electric nodes to your chest and stomach and legs, and they get the rhythm of your heart with that device. As we continue from left to right, that's an old Scientific Atlantic cable box. Above that is a thermostat that actually has physical buttons and switches on it, followed by a cordless phone, which was a very hot commodity in the 90s and even early 2000s. And then one of my favorites, the camcorder. Now, back in the day when these devices were in active use, and it wasn't that long ago, 10 years, maybe 15 at most, there was still software running on some of the embedded systems in there, so you could make real-time changes at the device itself. You didn't have to go through a software compilation program, but you had to be physically present at that device to make any kind of changes or even to use the device. And if you wanted to share data, you actually had to print something from the device, speak verbally over that wireless phone, go get some film developed to print a CD, whatever it was. But those were the good old days. Today, every single one of those devices have been replaced by something that looks like that. These are the equivalents, today's equivalents. The left-hand side is a mobile tablet that has a wireless or Wi-Fi enabled EKG device. To the right of that is a smart TV that no longer even needs a set-top box. And above that, a smart thermostat for connected home. Everyone, of course, will recognize the smartphone to the right of that, which allows you to do video, text, phone, voice, everything. And then instead of a camcorder, you can have a high-definition IP-enabled camera. So that is the today equivalent of those other devices. All of them still run on software. However, the percentage of software that is in these devices has grown exponentially, sometimes by an order of magnitude that is 4 or 5 times greater than the number of lines of code that were on those old devices. You still have the ability to make real-time changes. However, you can pretty much be anywhere to make those changes, anywhere to access the devices, to configure them, to get information from them. And sharing is virtually instantaneous and almost all digital. So again, probably not telling you anything new here, but it's interesting to me to at least see the transformation from even just 10 to 15 years ago to today, and how any one of these devices might share information with the other. Now let me talk through a couple of interesting either attacks or vulnerabilities that I found. And this one was from less than 2 years ago. It was October of 2016 when Dyn Systems, which is now part of Oracle, suffered a denial of service attack. And unfortunately, Dyn's business was serving up domain name routing to about a third of the internet. And a denial of service attack, basically, attackers compromised millions of IoT devices, mainly printers and IP-enabled cameras and even baby monitors, and they used it to flood all of the Dyn servers with traffic and basically brought the service to their knees and shut them down. But in doing so, they also shut down Amazon.com and Comcast and DirecTV and Netflix and Walgreens. None of these organizations could even serve up a web page, let alone process a transaction that required any kind of internet connectivity. It was a pretty massive attack. Dyn, much to its credit, handled it extremely well, recovered from it in very quick order. They suffered a fourth attack over the course of another day or two, and again, handled it very well. They were quite transparent about what happened and what they were doing about it. So as much as we have to be disappointed that a third of the internet went down, you do have to give Dyn credit for how they handled it, and I do. But that was a squarely IoT enabled attack. Some other ones that might hit a little bit closer to home. St. Jude's Medical Hospital, which does just amazing thing for sick children, unfortunately had almost 500,000 pacemakers that had a security vulnerability that allowed these implanted devices not only remote access, but drain the battery, deliver shock, or even change the pace, which of course is not what you want in a pacemaker. And again, all remotely exploitable IoT device embedded in a human. Owlet also had a child health-related security vulnerability for their Wi-Fi baby monitor. It connects through a baby's sock that you put on so you can see the baby's heart, any kind of heart trouble, or get alerts from your phone. And again, the connectivity made them exploitable, and there was a vulnerability in there that allowed essentially attackers to take over and just completely disable all of the notifications. So even though the best intentions here, trying to help sick children, unfortunately, the configurations or the vulnerabilities that were built into these devices ended up countermanding or potentially causing some real serious safety problems. And this is a boundary that we are crossing with the proliferation of IoT. It is that cybersecurity safety boundary, and that's something that a hack on a website typically has nothing to do with personal safety, but now with IoT devices driving most of our world, including our cars, we are getting into that scenario. Here's a couple of more examples. Governments and customers are getting directly involved. Recently, the Federal Trade Commission filed a lawsuit against D-Link because they claimed that their IP-enabled cameras and routers, due to a vulnerability and what was alleged to be a careless act and not trying to do something to correct that vulnerability, put thousands of customers at risk. And if you're a technology company, the last thing you want is the FTC filing a lawsuit against you. It has to get pretty bad before they end up doing that. But even on the business side of IoT, your customers can end up turning against you, and that was the case of John Deere. A lot of farmers bought tractors. I mean, that's what farmers do. They buy tractors. It's part of their capital expense for running a farm. And when tractors break down, farmers are very talented people in general. They have to do a lot of different things, and they typically take on the responsibility of fixing their tractor when it breaks down. Well, however, John Deere tractors that have been sold in the last 5+ years are actually IoT devices. They contain a fair amount of embedded software. They share a lot of information with John Deere and other folks that can connect to it for a maintenance perspective. But when the farmers wanted to go and repair their tractors, they were told by John Deere, no, you cannot, because you're violating a license agreement. Even though you bought the tractor and technically own the tractor, you can't make any repairs, you can't change the software because you're violating the license agreement under which you bought the tractor. And of course, the customers didn't like that. So they got together and decided to file a class action lawsuit. Now the company has since issued a new license agreement, but it still prohibits software modifications. And they're trying to do that again. They're viewing this as a potential business logic circumvention because they want all repairs done at authorized John Deere contractors. Naturally, some farmers who are very self-sufficient, robust folks want to do the repairs themselves. So there's a customer supplier battle going on there. And naturally, IoT comes with this risk trade-off of security versus convenience. And this is something we see in so many different scenarios, but in IoT it is just rampant. Consumers want devices that just work, and they demand convenient features and easy configuration. of course, until they backfire. And then they want the vendor to have all the responsibility for fixing any of those problems when things go wrong, yet they also want all of the convenience that comes with make it just work. And of course, often those two things are in direct conflict with each other. In fact, making things easy to set up and operate often means that you have to limit the authentication or have no authentication at all. So long as you power up your IT device, it will broadcast and connect the information that's collecting for you. However, lack of authentication can cause all sorts of problems, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. And when vulnerabilities are discovered, patching is very often the answer. However, patching IoT can be pretty difficult, impossible, and sometimes, frankly, illegal because of those license agreements that the manufacturers put in place. So you've got to be very careful and understand what your rights are as a consumer of an IoT device before you actually go and put it into production. And that brings me to our first polling question. And I will ask you, do you have an active IoT system or program today in place in your organization that has over 1,000 devices, sensors, machines, etc., that are exchanging data? So I would like to know from the audience, do you have, what is in place? So please, select the answer that is most appropriate for you, whether it's yes or no or unsure. I'm curious to see how many folks have an active IoT system or program with more than 1,000 devices or sensors. And what I'll do is I'll let folks vote, let them choose one or two, yes, no, or unsure, and then I'll read back what is coming. So have a handful of votes right now. Others are coming along. There we go. Right now, about half of the audience, 50%, they do have an active IoT deployment with over 1,000 endpoints. 40% say they do not, and more than 10% say unsure. So let that go on for another 30 seconds or so. There we go. We're getting a lot of votes rolling in now. Present counts are 45% yes, 40% no, 15% unsure. And the no's are starting to creep up. They're neck and neck with the yeses right now. All right, so I'll leave that open for another 5 seconds maybe. And I will stop voting in just a moment. There we go. All right, final tallies. Yes, 45%, no, 35%, and unsure, 20%. So thank you for voting. Moving on. Now that we've covered the IoT landscape very quickly and discussed why it's different and difficult, I want to talk about IoT ecosystem and attack surface. And I'll just start with, again, the most simple idea. You have some kind of embedded device, whether it's a microchip or a wireless-enabled anything, a sensor that's collecting some data like a rain sensor on your lawn irrigation system, and then it transmits that data to your controller to tell it to run or not run. The concept of IoT is simple. You've got these embedded devices or sensors collecting lots of information, distributing them through some type of computing device and being managed by some kind of central or point-to-point application, whether it's a smart application or it's just a data aggregation application. So the concept is simple. However, the attack vectors are numerous in that, albeit simple concept. Obviously, cloud applications and wireless networks are publicly accessible for the most part. Many devices lack the fundamental security concepts that we've come to just take for granted when it comes to website and network security. Things like encryption, open authentication, default usernames and passwords. And then there's also a lot of the physical issues that you have to deal with. Your sensors or IoT devices might be in places that are publicly accessible. They might have ports that are used for either debugging or analysis, like in JTAGs and UART ports. And that can lead to an escalated privilege on the device if someone plugs in something into that device. Then you've also got the communication protocols, whether it's radio or network or cellular or Wi-Fi or near-field communication, Bluetooth. Any number of them can be exploited. And then you get down to the device, a lot of weak firmware, whether it's unsigned firmware or firmware that is just written so poorly that it can be exploited with a simple attack. That can lead for an entire device compromise. And this is exactly what we saw in that Dyn attack. The Dyn attack, that distributed denial of service that took out about 1/3 of the internet, many of the IoT devices had no password. A number of the IoT devices had default usernames and passwords, which is easily discoverable by a quick internet search. And then some had usernames and passwords that were changed. However, they were able to be infected by the Mirai malware that brute forced those passwords, and thus you had a lot of tens of millions of devices that got compromised. Now, in reality, even though the concept of an IoT deployment system is a simple one, the actual IoT deployment can be complex. You can have your sensors that are collecting everything from vibration to the orientation of how someone is holding in the mobile phone, to moisture, to airflow, to chemicals that are detected in, say, a breathalyzer. All of this can be sent through a device back to a gateway. It can be aggregated and accessed through applications, and then you may have some kind of cloud system that's analyzing all of it. And every single one of those data exchange points, those arrows, those fuchsia-colored arrows you see on the screen, are potential compromising points, in addition to all of the devices and software applications themselves. So you end up having a pretty complex deployment system with many different attack vectors. Now, take the simple example of a web application versus an IoT deployment, which, of course, an IoT deployment can include a web application as part of its deployment, but if you just look at a simple IoT device and you look at that stack compared to a web application stack, you'll see that there's a lot of similarities between the network layer and the internet layer and the transport layer, but you'll often have different protocols. You'll have TCP for the web application, but you most likely don't have that with an IoT device. You have binary data formats instead of HTML formats or XML formats, and so up and down the stack you've got different things to consider at each phase. Now, as you're going through and trying to determine, well, what the heck is my attack surface? My recommendation is to look at each one of those elements in the stack and then start to enumerate the different areas or different pieces that you actually do use. So for authentication, authorization, for example, is there any username and password? If so, is it a default that came from the manufacturer, or maybe you are the manufacturer and you include a default? Are there user roles set up for each one? As you go up the stack, what types of communication channels are being used? Is it cellular? Is it Bluetooth? Is it near-field communication? Is it a combination? For the web application, for that admin interface, have you put it through a typical battery of testing for top 10 vulnerabilities, as is published by the Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP, and keep on going all the way up and up the stack. Same thing for the mobile application, device firmware. Device firmware is a real serious problem with IoT because a lot of firmware is completely unsigned, which aids in the ability to determine if it comes from an authentic source. Very difficult to update sometimes, or impossible to update, and often is left in an unprotected or unencrypted state, which just makes the compromise potential that much easier. So 4 top weak points in IoT. It is insufficient training, the risks of physical security access, insufficient updates, and weak data protection. And we'll talk about each one of these a little bit more detail. Insufficient security training really hits on the fact that the biggest weak spot in any typical IT deployment system, whether it's IoT or not, is the human. But with IoT, you have the humans that are building the IoT devices, the humans that are integrating the IoT devices into other types of IT systems, those folks who are deploying it and maintaining it and operating it, those folks who are using it. So you've got a multitude of different areas of security training that you need to roll out in order to secure an IoT deployment. I spoke a couple of minutes ago about the physical security access, these debug ports and interfaces, and even USB ports. They can allow, for this unintended device access, and also just given the fact that, cameras, IP-enabled cameras, by definition, you want them in typically in publicly accessible places or places of high sensitivity. It means that that physical access is probably not as constrained as you might want it to be. Updates are a major issue. Unlike a web application or even a mobile application, the concept is the same. However, if you have a remote IoT sensor sitting out in the middle of a field, getting an update to it, and the update is typically a software update or a firmware update, it's not always the easiest thing. And often, these IoT devices will have a very long lifespan, and they might be difficult or even impossible to update. When I think about an X-ray machine or a radiation machine, often they are completely disconnected from the hospital's network, again, by design, and they might have a lifespan of 5 to 10 years. So getting an update to them, which might be very important, might be a very difficult thing to do. And also, you have to make sure that the admin applications and interfaces are protected, the mechanisms through which updates get delivered, authenticated, and then ultimately processed. And then, of course, the weak data protection. Not using hardware-based protection systems like the Trusted Platform Module or a TPM chip to store sensitive information, as opposed to leaving an unprotected, unencrypted file sitting on the IoT device. But it's not just files at rest, it's also in transit. Often, because IoT devices have limited computing power, encryption is completely ignored because it can consume power and slow down the throughput of an IoT device. And of course, that just expands your attack surface and makes it, you just make things a lot easier for an attacker to get access to that sensitive data you're trying to protect. Okay, time for our next polling question. What type of testing do you use, what type of security testing for IoT devices do you currently practice? And as we queue up that next question, the options are penetration testing, attack simulation or red teaming, threat modeling or risk review, all of the above, or none of the above. So please make your selections now. What type of testing, security testing specifically, for IoT devices do you practice? So here we have 5 choices instead of 3. We've increased the number of choices. And as the first set of votes roll in, we have a large leader in none of the above, which is answer number 5. Again, not too surprising. A lot of times it's difficult to conduct testing on IoT devices, again, because of sometimes a restriction in a license agreement. You might not own the device, or you simply might not know how to test the device itself. We see some folks that do penetration testing, maybe 1 out of 5. Less than 10% do some kind of risk review or threat model, or even just a paper security audit. We have 1 out of 4 right now. We're doing all of the above: penetration testing, attack simulation, and threat modeling, which is great. Have to applaud you folks that are doing that. That's terrific. Still far and above, the leader here is none of the above, by about a 2-to-1 margin over anything else right now. Penetration testing and all of the above being in second. Have a number of votes in, which is great, but I'm going to leave this open for about another 10 seconds. So if you haven't voted, please go ahead and do so. We have our first votes for attack simulation of red teaming, which is good to see. And another 4 seconds, 3, 2, 1, and we're done. All right, final tally. What type of security testing do you practice for IoT devices and systems? Penetration testing, 20%, red teaming and attack sim, 2%, threat modeling risk review, 12%, all of the above, 22%, and none of the above, nearly half, or 42%. No security testing for any IoT devices or systems. Okay, moving along. Next, we want to talk about managing liability and risks to consumers and vendors in the IoT space. And just enumerating some of the main IoT risks. Again, none of this will be a surprise to you, but you have privacy or personally identifiable information leakage, which becomes all the more important now that new compliance frameworks and laws have come into effect, such as GDPR. If your device is connecting any kind of personal information, whether it's health, it's biometrics, it's physical location that can be tied to an individual, you have to be very careful about protecting that information, because if it can be tied back to an individual and they haven't given you permission to collect and use it, you could be violating the new GDPR law. Mass surveillance, theft, of course, data breaches, reputation liability, as well as physical and financial liability. And then, of course, you always have to be concerned about the botnets, whether it's Mirai, which was used in the Dyn attack, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, or it's just queuing up a whole bunch of botnets to see, which IoT devices are publicly accessible and still have the default username and password available on it. That attack has been relatively common over the past couple of years, believe it or not. And unfortunately, Mirai is now available as open source software, freely customizable, so you can create your own malware as your heart desires. I don't recommend doing that, by the way. As we move on, and again, you're getting to the point where you want to conduct some kind of assessment of IoT risk, and you're one of the 42% on this webcast that do nothing in terms of security testing for IoT. And again, nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of reasons why that might be the case. But let me give you at least some frameworks or some tips that might help you get started. And again, I go right back to that attack surface analysis where I just kind of enumerate sort of the top 6 areas. You've got device hardware and firmware, a mobile or a web application that might be interfacing with it. You've got data management. Consider what channels or networks you're transmitting data over, and then what you have in terms of user authentication or roles. And here's just an example where in my fictional company, we buy IoT devices from vendor X. We outsource the mobile application development to vendor Y because we don't have any mobile developers in-house, but we do have web developers, so we write the web application ourselves. Because it's our data, responsibility for data management is all on us in terms of storage, transportation, and protection. And then we use telco company X to transmit all of our data. Let's say it's cellular, just for an example. And again, user authentication and roles, that responsibility is on us. So once we identify the connection in the IoT chain and the ownership, now we start to move on to the threats. And what I'm doing here, by the way, is a very simplified threat model, which of course takes no technology to conduct. You can just conduct it using paper, spreadsheets, tables, flow charts, mind maps. I'm a big believer in threat modeling. In this case, I'm just using a simple Excel table. So what are the threats that I want to know about in vendor X's hardware? Well, I want to know about existing security vulnerabilities that are published. Maybe vendor X has published them themselves, or I can discover them from some kind of central repository. I also want to understand what vendor X's patching process is for vulnerabilities. Are these devices that I'm buying, can they be patched? If so, how are they patched? How frequently? What's the escalation process once a vulnerability is discovered in vendor X's device? And how do they prioritize their vulnerabilities? Do they have a vulnerability disclosure program? Many of these questions are good things to ask. Moving on to the mobile application and vendor Y in this example, I would want to understand what are the secure software development activities that vendor Y conducts. Do they do security code reviews? Do they do threat modeling on mobile applications that they build for customers like me? Do they conduct security code reviews? If so, how do they do it? When do they do it? Is it at check-in or is it at compile time? I just want to understand what they do for security so I can understand when I'm going back and answering, whether it's to my board of directors, my audit committee, whatever it is, I've done at least some level of due diligence on vendor X and vendor Y when it comes to security, because I can't control what they do necessarily, but I've at least done some kind of assessment and I know and I'm aware of it. And when it comes down to facing compliance pressures or customer pressures or legal pressures, when you actually start the assessment program and can demonstrate that you have actually conducted some type of risk assessment or threat assessment, it dramatically improves your defensibility from a legal perspective. Now, I'm no lawyer, so talk to your lawyers about that, but this is what I've heard and I've seen in my 15 years working in the security industry here. Now, on the web application side, since we're developing it as opposed to vendor Y, I want to ask those same questions I did of vendor Y to my own team. What are our secure software development activities? What are our processes? What tools or third parties do we use to help secure the web application that we're building, etc. From a data management perspective, this is all about data classification and understanding how it's stored, how it's transmitted, and how it's protected. And again, it doesn't really matter what compliance framework or law you have to follow, whether it's PCI, GDPR, any of those, they will still care about how sensitive data is stored, transmitted, and protected. So those are really the key questions you want to start asking. When it comes to the network that you're using, and in my example, I was using a cellular network, I'd want to go straight to my service level agreement with that particular telco and understand what kind of security guarantees do I have, what practices do they follow when it comes to securing the data I'm pushing over their network, because again, I don't have control over that, so I want to ask those due diligence questions. And finally, when it comes to user roles, I want to understand if there are different user roles for this particular IoT device or system, and if so, what can each role do? And for each one of those roles, how are they authenticated? Is it username and password? Is it two-factor authentication? And do we have higher levels of authentication for higher privileged roles? Those are the kinds of questions that I want to be asking to start my IoT risk assessment. Now, in this example, what I've done here is I've just built a simple threat tree. And this is a threat that I've come up with about compromising an application password. And this application can be on an IoT device. It can be in a mobile application that's accessing the IoT device. It can be in a cloud system that is storing all of my information. Let's say I'm a user of a smart speaker system. Whether it's a Bose or a Sonos or something like that. And I've got a mobile application on my phone that I use to control all of my IoT devices, these hardware devices that send music out into my house that have Wi-Fi connections and Bluetooth connections. And I take that and then I share that with my speaker manufacturer because I want them to market new products to me and send me coupon codes and connect me with some of their partners so I can get the latest and greatest music feeds. So created this threat tree and say, well, what if my password were compromised? Or if I'm the maker of that system, I do this. What if a user's application is compromised? And then I just go through all of the different ways it could be compromised. Well, it could be compromised in use. It could be compromised in the database. It could be compromised by having someone guess the password. And then I expand that out. Well, someone could guess the password because it's too weak, or they could use a brute force attack, et cetera, et cetera. And as I go through and I build all of these branches on that particular threat tree, I then want to determine how I can mitigate those threats. Well, I can force someone to use a strong password on the right-hand side, which will mitigate the threat of a weak password, for example. I could, if someone is sniffing the network and stealing my password in network, I can use something like TLS to protect it. Now, when you have this threat tree, one of the beauties of doing threat modeling, in my opinion, is that you have this as a living, breathing asset that you can move forward. And when something like Heartbleed becomes known, you can look exactly to determine whether or not you're at risk. And in this case, we will be at risk because for TLS, we decided to use open source SSL version 1.0.1f, which was vulnerable to Heartbleed. So I'm the maker of this the speaker system with a mobile application and a web application, and I've chosen OpenSSL, this particular version. All of a sudden, Heartbleed comes out, and I need to understand, am I vulnerable or not? Oh my gosh, yes, I am. So what do? I need to update my OpenSSL library in the applications that I'm using it. And again, that's, for me, just the beauty of threat modeling, and it applies equally to IoT systems just as it can to any other type of system. So, that example there, we went from the speaker that's sending music through a mobile phone on a mobile application to a cloud application that's storing all this information. Now, here are 5 tips for securing IoT systems. Now, these are Ed's tips, and at the end of the webcast, by the way, you will be offered a IoT security tip sheet, as well as some other goodies that Rebecca can talk about. But here are my top 5 tips for securing IoT system. First and foremost, if you're purchasing IoT technology from a vendor, go and research that vendor. Understand what is their track record when it comes to updating and patching and vulnerability disclosure. Secondly, invest in IoT security training for your teams. And it's not just the teams that will be operating the IoT system, but the teams that will be configuring it and putting it into deployment. The teams that will be coding interfaces into your ERP systems or supply chain channels or web applications. And if you're a manufacturer of IoT devices, the team that is actually writing the code that is going and getting embedded onto these IoT devices. IoT security training, again, for me, biggest bang for the buck that you can deliver to your teams, and it is really a need across the board. It's not just in the awareness level. It's at those technical teams, the operations teams, the IT teams, the configuration teams, and the development and coding teams. Third is perform penetration testing if you can. And again, it doesn't have to be deep penetration testing. It can be attack simulation. It can be a tabletop exercise. It could be threat modeling. But if you do actual penetration testing, make sure you obtain a right from any third party before you go and test their device or the system, because you might be trampling their service level agreement or their license agreement. In fact, you might be doing something illegal. So definitely obtain rights to penetration testing of third-party products, if at all. Adopt a defense in depth strategy. This is Security 101, and it really goes more toward that configuration and operations team. But if, for example, you determine that you have, you're using a certain card reader for door access in your building, and you've determined that that card reader is susceptible to SQL injection attack, instead of allowing that to be passed all the way back to your servers, maybe you put a web application firewall between that card reader IoT device and the database or the cloud administration app that's interfacing with it, so you don't have a propagation. Defense in depth, Security 101. And then this last one is probably second most important behind training, in my opinion. Eliminate any hard-coded or default passwords. That is what really spelled a doom for Dyn. And it wasn't even their IoT systems. It was IoT systems that got purchased and deployed that either had default usernames and passwords or hard-coded usernames and passwords, or no usernames and passwords that were easily compromised and then used to beat the crap out of Dyn and take down a third of the internet. All right, now, those are Ed's top 5 tips. The Federal Trade Commission, U.S. Federal Trade Commission, FTC, has published a IoT security best practices document, and the URL is at the bottom of the screen. And by the way, you will be provided a copy of the slides and a replay of this webcast if you want to share it with others or had to miss all or part of it. So don't worry about trying to scramble and write down this URL. But here's their 7 top tips. And frankly, it's very similar to those top 5 that I had on the previous page. You'll see train employees, consider defense in depth, things like that. So that's the FTC's top 7. I gave you Ed's top 5 just a minute ago. Moving along to our third and final polling question. Do you plan on delivering or purchasing IoT-specific security training for your teams in the next 12 months? So I am, and the answers here are only yes, no, or unsure. So I will give folks a little bit of time to answer that as we're going through. And votes are starting to roll in. Do you plan to purchase or deliver IoT-specific security training for your teams in the next 12 months? Yes, no, or unsure. So far, we have 100% either no or unsure. Nobody has said yes. Aha, and now the yeses have perked up, and they're starting to roll in. 15% of folks say yes, they plan to purchase or deliver IoT-specific training for their teams in the next 12 months. And it's holding steady at 15%, with 85% still no or unsure. All right, votes are starting to pile up, and it's rolling in. I'm going to let folks go on for another 30, 45 seconds while I address a couple of questions from the audience. So, rolling in. Keep on voting, folks. You have another 15 seconds or no. Wow, the yeses are really caught up here. It's almost a third, a third, a third. All right, I think we're going to close voting out at this point in time. So we're going to stop the voting. We have 26% yes, 34% no, 38% unsure. So wow, those yeses waited till the very last second, but they almost caught up. Roughly a third, a third, a third. All right, moving on. I want to get in some time about auditing IoT development and deployment. So what I'm doing in these next slides is I want to give you specific questions and ideas and tips to ask around auditing IoT systems. And I want to start with these three high-level objectives with the recognition that you will never be able to meet them all 100%. This is sort of the ideal world. It's nirvana. It would be great if we can do it, but they're good guiding principles. Try to get all processes in development of the technology controlled, all protocols assessed, and any new capabilities assessed from a risk perspective. You want to start with simple questions. So ask things like, how is the IoT systems that we have deployed in our system, who owns each respective component, etc. What do we know in terms of the data that's collected and stored? And do we have any potential legal exposure? This is where you need to map your governance policies to the data that is captured. And again, obviously keep in mind changes to controls like the recent GDPR law that came into effect on May 25th. And finally, from a disaster recovery and business continuity perspective, you also have to consider if things go wrong with your IoT system, do you have a contingency plan, and what would those be? Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about auditing IoT for three specific groups: a development group, a systems deployment and integration group, and finally, an infrastructure group. So starting with development. So these are for organizations that are actually constructing or building IoT systems. And here, the simple questions that you want to be asking from an audit perspective is, has it been built to minimum requirements? Is it tamper-proof? How is critical data protected? And how are updates processed? And some of the things to consider or look for when you're doing your audit testing is, on the minimum requirements front, have the business analysts and program managers defined the fewest features necessary to meet and obtain the business objectives. From a tamper-proof perspective, you want to be able to determine whether or not someone has physically tampered with the device. So if the device is open, the cover of the device is open, for example, you want some kind of notification process. In terms of protecting critical data might be things like encryption keys. And for that, you want to determine whether or not you're using a hardware-based root of trust, like a trusted platform module or a TPM. And the latest version of TPM, which is 2.0, is made for smaller footprint devices, perfectly made for IoT. And then when it comes to updates, as we've talked a lot in this presentation, updates for IoT devices are critical. So you want to make sure that there is a process in place for updates. And ideally, you don't have to have physical access, because that means it's going to be more difficult, sometimes impossible, to process those updates. Now, moving on to organizations that are integrating and deploying IoT systems. These are for folks that are building APIs or integrating with ERP systems or supply chain management systems. You want to ask questions around secure software development practices. So, for example, do we as an organization follow a specific methodology like Microsoft SDL? How are interfaces and boundaries constrained or tested? Do we do any kind of fuzz testing? What do we do for API documentation and sanitizing input and output that's going to and from various devices? How are we protecting keys? And again, the questions about physical security. If the IoT device has these debug ports or USB ports, have we disabled them, or at least put in some kind of logging so we can get notified whenever they're accessed? Other questions to ask from an IoT system and deployment perspective revolves around authentication. And here you specifically want to identify which roles have been defined for the IoT system. And for each one of those, what kind of authentication is required? Do you have just a simple username and password? Do you mandate strong passwords? What about the use of multi-factor authentication like biometrics or some kind of code that you have to enter that's generated on your cell phone? And finally, the communications channel. Once you feel comfortable that the IoT device itself can be logged into and accessed appropriately, when you are communicating data to or from the device, what channels are you using? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it Bluetooth? And are those transport mechanisms secured by encryption using something like TLS? And of course, remember earlier in this presentation, we talked about choosing the appropriate version of TLS so you're not susceptible to things like Heartbleed. Now, moving on from an infrastructure or ops department, when you're auditing IoT systems in production, the first thing you want to ask about is, have all of the device drivers and operating systems and updates been processed for these IoT devices? And then you can get a little bit deeper and ask, have they been signed and verified to make sure that they're coming from an authenticated source? Then you want to ask about event logging. Again, physical protection. Do these devices allow for access? People walking by, can they poke at them? Can they disable them physically? And then if the device is communicating with any kind of cloud-based application or data repository or analytics, what are you doing in terms of protecting passwords coming in and out of that, and then configuring appropriately for cloud security? So wrapping up in the last couple of minutes here, 4 takeaways. And these are going to be universal regardless of whether you're developing IoT systems, you're integrating, or you're operating them. First and foremost, follow the data. That's exactly what the hackers are going to be doing. And the critical data is all around authentication. How do you access the device? And how easy or difficult is it to get access to the device? Secondly, analyze your attack surface. The more open doors you have, the bigger problems you have, and the fewer things you can enable, the better. Again, it just goes back to the minimum requirements that we talked about just a couple minutes ago. Finally, treat IoT devices as insecure by default. Most likely they're somewhere remote and will have the ability to be accessed either through some kind of Wi-Fi or internet connection, or even physically. So assume that they're insecure and make sure that any data that's coming into your system from those IoT devices are properly sanitized. And finally, understand the roles and responsibilities. Who owns every single activity, whether it's external, third parties, internal, all the way through development and deployment. So those 4 things will help you on your way toward a secure software system when it comes to IoT. Finally, last couple of slides. I know we're running out of time, and I don't think I'm going to have time for live questions, but let me just finish with how security innovation can help you. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we focus on software security, whether it's in IoT systems, cloud applications, web applications, mobile applications. And what we do is we help you set standards to make sure that your goals are clearly defined and easy to meet. We provide education to enable you to learn how to meet those standards, and then we provide assessments so you can understand where you might be falling short and build a roadmap for remediation. As I mentioned, we don't have enough time for questions, unfortunately, because we're right at the end of our presentation. However, as I mentioned, these slides will be shared with you, and the recording will be made available. My email address, for those who want it, it's simply eadams@securityinnovation.com, E as in Ed, Adams@securityinnovation.com, and it's now showing on the screen. Feel free to email me, tweet at AppSec or at SecInnovation, or email getsecure@securityinnovation.com with any questions. So for now, thank you. I appreciate your time, and have a great day.